respecting human rights is crucially important for any business, irrespective of the size, sector, geographic location, or legal structure, right?
My guest is a specialist on business and human rights.
It's not just about compliance, policies, or checklist. It's about seeing every decision through the lens of human dignity.
She's working for the UN Development Programme in Bangkok, supporting governments and businesses in human rights challenges.
No matter where you operate, your commitment to respecting human rights remains consistent and clear. So I would say start with that.
Greiner Talks. We talk transformation. Listen in and get inspired.
My name is Alexander. I'm part of the People and Culture team at Greiner. Welcome, Harpreet Kaur.
Thanks, Alexander. I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Harpreet, I'm in Vienna. You are in Bangkok, two amazing, very different cities. How are you doing? What's the highlight of your day?
I'm doing very well. Well, the highlight of the day has been that the preparations for the upcoming United Nations Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum is coming along very well. And I think that will continue to be highlight of my month.
My highlight at the moment is definitely talking to you. We are discussing business and human rights today. For more than 5 years, you are leading human rights initiatives at the UNDP in Bangkok. You are also teaching business and human rights. That's how we got to know each other. And in previous roles, you gained a lot of experience all across Asia promoting human rights. What drives you? What inspires you to work in this field?
Well, I started my career in conflict resolution and peace building, where I experienced firsthand how trade could bridge divides and build trust across conflict lines. And I saw that trade and how businesses operated, it wasn't just about goods crossing borders. It was about connecting divided families. It was about creating dependency and value, and ultimately helping people realize their human rights in tangible ways. And I remember interviewing one elderly woman during actually my PhD times who had lost both her husband and son to the conflict. And she said, until we resolve the big conflict, we still have to live our day-to-day lives, and we need governance for that. And I think that's a moment that stuck with me also in terms of demonstrating the value of both active listening, but also including the voices of the affected communities and to find solutions for their day-to-day lives. That was my entry to the business and human rights when it wasn't even called as such.
So it was this particular moment in your past, in your beginning of the career that really connected you to this topic that shaped your career.
It indeed did. In fact, when I started working formally sort of about 15 years ago in the business and human rights space, there wasn't, the question really was, what does businesses have to do with human rights? And the assumption and the understanding, at least in Asia where I was working primarily at that time, was still that corporations should exercise their power only for the benefit for their shareholders, and that respecting human rights is not the business of business. We've come a long way from there, and I've really sort of seen this progress, and I've seen the field developing in the last couple of years at a very, very fast pace. And thanks to voluntary and mandatory requirements and developments, increased awareness among consumers, but also understanding among investors of linkages between social and financial and so on. So, just kind of knowing the power that businesses hold today to drive good if they want to, or cause great harm. And I think that's something that keeps inspiring me to sort of come to work every single day, that there are those opportunities where we could move the businesses from not doing that great harm, but to drive good. And I think that keeps inspiring.
And as someone who is deeply committed to human rights, do you find that this perspective influences how you experience everyday life, even when you walk through a huge city like Bangkok or when you're traveling the world?
I mean, absolutely. If you look at in terms of the way businesses pretty much control everything that we do, look at how it is probably just 10 companies that control almost everything that we eat. I mean, any product that we use, the way that the businesses have more market capitalization than the combined GDP of various countries. And I think it impacts our day-to-day life in how decisions are being made. It impacts the products that we use, but it also impacts the value that we derive from various products and services.
It's a very interesting perspective that nearly any activity we do as human beings requires some kind of business behind it.
I mean, absolutely. If you look at it, you are there in Austria, I'm here in Bangkok, we are recording this, and we're using every single device that's, been developed by business. So you see that there's a huge value, and you see how business is enabling us to have a conversation from across the borders, from across, I don't know how many kilometers or distances apart. But at the same time, you look at the value and you look at the harm that it could have in terms of how technology companies could harm and abuse human rights within how they operate and how these products are being made. I mean, including from our phones to the laptops that we're using, how minerals are extracted and how they are processed, what kind of labor force has been used and the way that has been engaged. So I think it does impact in every single way.
Now we are already diving deep into the topic, which is a very complex and a very broad topic, as we can see. And I'd like to speak a little bit about Greiner, a company that is 100% family owned, that exists since more than 155 years, and that is definitely committed to a responsible business conduct. What's the role of human rights for such an Austrian family owned company?
Sure. I mean, respecting human rights is important for any business, irrespective of the size, sector, geographic location, or legal structure, right? So even if it's a family-owned business, respecting human rights is crucially important. But also, if you look at the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which have become the most authoritative global standard for guiding businesses in respecting and upholding human rights throughout their operations and value chains, including for a family-owned businesses, that perhaps have operations in many, many other countries and regions, I think it's equally important.
And now Greiner is operating in 30 plus countries around the world. And the human rights challenges in these countries are very different, as you have mentioned before. How can we cope with these differences? Do you have any advice here?
It's interesting you asked this question. In our human rights work, we are often asked about universality versus cultural relativism, particularly in the kind of work that we do and in the space of human rights. It becomes even more challenging when you operate across geographies with diverse socio-cultural and economic contexts. So I think it definitely is challenging. Now, I don't have a super solution, but perhaps a suggestion would be to stay anchored in a global framework, but ensure you take a proactive, localized approach. So therefore, stakeholder engagement is really, really critical. I would also suggest that don't assume. Talk to local experts, talk to communities when you're developing your strategies, when you're developing your policies and programming. So bring in local stakeholders also at the time of development and not just implementation. And I think eventually uphold UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as one of the global standards. So to ensure that no matter where you operate, your commitment to respecting human rights remains consistent and clear. So I would say start with that.
I'm now thinking a lot about another field that I'm working in, that is diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we say that listening and trying to understand is one of the most important tasks that you can do. Would you say this also counts for business and human rights?
Absolutely. Active listening and meaningfully engaging are both equally important for all the work that you're doing in the DI space, but also human rights space as well.
And if you would have to break it down, what's your number one advice for a company like Greiner to protect, to respect, to promote human rights? Or let's put it differently, what's your advice for a company that wants to do it right?
My advice would be to make human rights personal for a company. It's not just about compliance, policies, or checklist. It's about seeing every decision through the lens of human dignity. When you view human rights as something that's deeply connected to people's lives, whether your employees, your communities, your customers, you approach your businesses differently. And I think it's also about fostering, again, a culture where everyone from your factory floor to the boardroom feels responsible for the impact they have on others. When you start treating human rights as a shared responsibility, not just as a corporate obligation, you naturally start to protect and promote them. So lead with empathy, stay curious about the people affected by your business, and make decisions that honor their humanity. I think that would be my number one advice. But of course, how to do this would be to start conducting with human rights due diligence in each country where you operate. This means identifying risk, understanding local context, engaging with local stakeholders to address specific issues. And I guess tailoring these approaches across different regions perhaps help us navigate the complexities of different human rights challenges effectively.
And going beyond corporate obligations and going beyond laws, there's not only national legislation and human rights, there's also expectations by society, by people. And probably that's equally important for global companies. What's your take here?
No, absolutely. And I think that's where I alluded initially to also to sort of make sure that, while you're following global standards and staying anchored to the global standard, your processes are all informed by local socio-cultural context. So I guess continuous learning and collaboration perhaps is the key. And if you stay engaged with local communities, civil society, and experts and other stakeholders, and you adapt to changing situations, I think is a way to go forward.
And we have talked a lot about companies, about their obligations. We've also touched upon global frameworks, legislation. But looking at the consumer side, what can each one of us as an individual do to protect, to promote human rights in daily decisions?
I mean, as I said initially, just like a company, start thinking about how does my action impact others' human rights. Even as consumers, we start looking at the impact that our actions could make. So, smaller things that we could do. So, if you're using plastic, what impact does it create on people? What impact does it create on planet? As consumers, if we're going to keep buying clothes after clothes or footwear after footwear, how does it impact, again, planet? But also, you have to think about where my clothes are made. So the key really is to sort of stay curious about how my actions are affecting other people and planet overall. And then that's how, even as consumers, we make our decisions.
Harpreet, you are active in the human rights sphere since more than 15 years. You have a lot of experience. You have seen a lot of developments in that sphere. I'd like to know from you, where is our global society currently heading with respect to human rights?
Our global society is taking 2 steps forward and then we take 4 steps backwards. So there seems to be a constant push and pull ongoing. But essentially, it feels like we're all at a crossroads. On one hand, there's been incredible progress, greater awareness, stronger laws, and a growing expectation that businesses, governments, and individuals uphold human dignity. Human rights are also more embedded in the global conversations with businesses, with investors, with international forums, much more than ever before. So you see that there's a progress on that side, right? But at the same time, we continue to face significant challenges. Economic inequalities have risen and have widened more than ever. Environmental crisis is at its worst. And the rise of authoritarianism are putting pressure on the progress we have made. There's a constant tension between advancing human rights and the forces that threaten to erode them. And I'll give you an example. This year marks the 40th anniversary since the Bhopal gas disaster, where toxic gas was released from a pesticide plant, killing thousands and leaving long-lasting health impacts on survivors. Despite the severity of the tragedy, the company responsible has gone through mergers, acquisitions, and changes in ownership, further complicating efforts for justice. But to this day, many of the victims and their families are still seeking compensation and accountability 4 decades later. So you see that there's a lot of progress in the business and human rights space, holding businesses accountable, but then you have this case, where you're still seeking remedy 40 years later. So I think where we are heading depends on the choices we make now. As I said, we're at this crossroad. If we stay committed to protecting rights, holding power accountable, and ensuring that global progress includes everyone. I think that's the only way that we can continue moving forwards for a more just and equitable world. But again, it requires vigilance, collaboration, and the courage to confront the challenges head on.
So there's a lot of progress, but there's also quite a lot of pushbacks, which makes it very difficult and even more important to keep on working in this field.
Absolutely.
And Harpreet, what's your vision, your personal vision for the future of human rights on a global level?
I guess my vision for the future of human rights is one where human dignity is at the heart of every decision. I see a world where human rights are not just ideals, but everyday practice, perhaps with businesses and with other actors creating positive change. I often give an example, when I teach in terms of how all of our conversations around gender equality have in some ways become a human resource problem than a human rights issue. So whenever you talk about gender equality, I think we're looking at the solutions in terms of the quotas, the numbers, but we seem to have sort of forgotten the reason why we started talking about it, which was because of equality and dignity. I see a vision and a future for human rights where gender equality and intersectionality are key, because we all know that human rights are deeply influenced by the social norms. And really, to achieve true equality, we must address the interconnected ways in which discrimination affects people across gender, race, class, and more.
Harpreet, there's so many things we could talk about, but we are slowly coming to an end of this conversation. But before I let you go, I would love to wrap it up with you. I would start a sentence and ask you to complete it.
Okay, let's try that.
Greiner Talks. Let's wrap it up. I get inspired by...
My daughter, she challenges me every single day.
We need to start...
Yesterday.
Let's talk about...
Everything under the sun.
What I wish for.
Peace, fairness, and lasting change.
Your message to the world.
Empathy, justice, equality for all.
Thank you for wrapping it up on such an uplifting note, Harpreet. It has been fantastic speaking to you.
It has been a great conversation. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you everyone for listening. Don't forget to register for the UN Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum starting later this September in Bangkok, and have a lovely day.
Visit Greiner.com. Share your thoughts and let us know who you think should be our next guest. Greiner Talks. Subscribe now.